Well, welcome to the show again. Today I have Philip Pilkington. He's my guest, and Philip is an economist, a macroeconomist, and a former investment advisor. He's based in Central Europe now, and I'm very pleased to have him join us because lately I've been following Phil in a good way and noticed that he's prepared a couple of very, very interesting reports. One of them is called Reindustrialization in the Age of Fragmentation, and that's one of the reports that I'd like to talk to Philip about. And the other one is one that really touches on the issue of, well, it's more geopolitics, but it's the economics of potential warfare. And it's a report called Military Alliance and Economic Capacity. Hopefully, we'll cover off on those two reports today and get some insights from Philip. And if we've got time, we'll try and touch on a couple of issues happening in and around Central Europe. So, Philip, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Warwick.
It's a pleasure. Look, a little while ago, you published a report, Reindustrialization in the Age of Fragmentation, and I thought it touched on some really important points about the state of the industrial structure or the composition of the capital structure of advanced Western economies, particularly in that medium term context. You know, we're not talking 1 or 2 year market cycles, we're talking about a 30, 40 year window. And you then touch on some of the challenges of reindustrialization. Could you just walk us through the guts of that report and what led you to the conclusions that you arrived at?
Yeah, so basically, I think the premise of the report is that everybody, or at least most people, have now understand that deindustrialization is a problem. This is a development in and of itself. I think it's probably a positive development personally. I've always thought that deindustrialization was a problem, but obviously for the long period of globalization from, the early 1990s until I'd say the first Trump administration, really, and actually because Trump was controversial, we're probably talking about the Biden administration. Most people were in denial about this. They said that industrial capacity in an economy doesn't really matter as long as an economy is growing. If it's a service-based consumption economy, that makes no difference to anything. And there were all sorts of arguments put forward by this. I mean, part of what was most shocking to my mind, being a macroeconomist, and we deal with many of those aspects in the report, is that economists who were papering over the problem with industrial policy or non-industrial policy, but industrialization and so on, were implicitly and often explicitly saying that trade deficits and current account deficits don't matter. That's very difficult to swallow, even if you're kind of a standard, textbook macroeconomist. I'm not really, but even if you are, current account and trade deficits should, in a way, matter. We won't go too much into that, but just to give some kind of background of the issues that this kind of change in mood has raised. So I'm kind of implicitly assuming that most people are on board with the fact that that having a large or decent industrial component to your economy, and therefore also balancing your trade, because the two things tend to go together, is important for an economy. So the fact that people now recognize that means that you can say, okay, what are the challenges of reindustrialization moving forward? And I think that's what we kind of tested in the paper. Actually, a lot of the tests, I think, were negative in the sense that we tried to find are certain things required for reindustrialization. One of them that we featured prominently in there is wages. Do you need low wages to have a robust industrial sector? And we find no. And of course, what's actually nice about doing a paper like that, where you test a bunch of different things, is you can publish negative results. Because to me, it means just as much to tell policymakers you can have a high wage economy and have an industrial sector. Those two things aren't mutually exclusive. That also debunks certain narratives about China, for example, saying that, well, their industrialization is only a factor of their low wages. I think people are increasingly seeing that that's not true today. So we tested a bunch of these hypotheses. I suppose looming in the background of the report, and I think in general, it's part of a series of papers we're doing here called the Connectivity Series at the Hungarian Institute of International Affairs. What we are kind of aiming at is, I think that Hungary is taking a slightly different line to the rest of the world on these problems. The rest of the world has woken up to them, and it seems to have a kind of a knee-jerk reaction to say, well, we just need to pull up the drawbridges, we need protectionism, et cetera, et cetera. I've never been convinced of that. I've been involved in the industrial policy debates going right back to the beginning of the Trump administration around the Journal of American Affairs and so on, and I've never been sold on the protectionist argument. I think it could actually be very destructive. And so kind of one of the kind of backdrops to the paper, sorry to give such a long intro, but I think it's important, is that effectively we're trying to implicitly convince people that, you know, you can follow a path of reindustrialization. It won't be easy. There are no quick fix solutions, but many of the things that you think might be standing in your way, like, as I said, not having a low wage structure in your economy, aren't necessarily there. So we're trying to kind of give a positive message to policymakers who do care about industrialization, but who maybe are curious beyond this kind of, I call it vulgar protectionism in a sense.
Yeah, it reminds me in many respects to the debates that I recall in the 1980s when I was doing my doctorate. It was a revisionist history of manufacturing, of Australian manufacturing, and many of the issues that I was looking at back then touched on the issues that people are very, very sensitive to now. And one of those, of course, is this question of protectionism. The report actually makes clear that protectionism is really not a pathway to reindustrialization, and that reindustrialization is incredibly more complex, if you will, than that, requiring substantial investments both in human capital and in physical capital, if you will, or fixed capital. Perhaps you could just enlighten us a little bit more around what the limitations are of that protectionist knee-jerk reaction, if you will, understandable as it often is, and the more constructive, if challenging, pathways that public policymakers may need to be thinking seriously about if they're going to begin this arduous journey of reindustrialization.
Yeah, so I think the protectionist knee-jerk reaction, as you say, it is understandable in a sense, although I have to say I am quite shocked that economists have fallen into this trap. I mean, I'm not that old, and when I was doing economics, everyone told you about the disastrous protectionism of the 1930s. If you did an economic history class, The World in Depression by Charles Kindleberger was required reading. It told you all about how bad Smoot-Hawley and everything was and how it made everything worse. So I am actually slightly shocked that economists have fallen into this trap. It seems to be some strange collective amnesia. I think it has to do with the geopolitical changes that we're seeing in the world today. But the short answer is protectionism. Look, I keep emphasizing to people, I'm not particularly against tariffs personally, if they're correctly applied. If you want to protect an industry that already exists, you can engage in incremental tariff increases. China does this, by the way, all the time, and it's quite successful. Like in America, if they wanted to defend American steel against much cheaper Chinese steel, I don't see any objection to putting a small tariff on American steel. Is that allowed under WTO rules? Will the Chinese counterbalance it? Okay, those are all questions, but in theory, there's no problem. The issue there is that the industry already exists. The clue is in the word protection, right? You are protecting something you already have. Protection, that's what it is. You have to have the industry before you protect it. If you don't have the industry, you can't protect it. But this magical way of thinking seems to have sprung up. Actually, ironically, I think it's out of free market. I think it's out of the supply side school in America. I've been following the debate a bit over there in some of the think tanks, and I think it's coming out of the supply side school. And I think what they're thinking is they don't really think through tariffs in general because they're supply siders, and supply siders tend to be free traders just in general. And so when they're forced to think through the problem of a trade and industrial policy, they say, well, if we raise tariffs, a very simple microeconomic model, then the prices of those external goods will go up, and the domestic industries will spring up like mushrooms after rain. That they'll just appear. The market will just poof, bring them into existence. But that's not the case at all. That's just building an industry is not like that. Just to take the example of steel, China produces most of the steel in the world. I think most people will know that. At this stage, that steel industry took years. It took 10 or 15 years to develop. And to go back, like if America is to reindustrialize, it will require massive skill adjustments. The people that I used to work with in finance. I used to work with brilliant people with physics PhDs and wizard math skills that were applying them to bond convexity curves in bond markets and so on. A lot of people think this is a waste of time. It probably is a waste of time, to be honest, but that's what they're applying those skills to. They need to retrain as engineers, not as finance quants. So all of these, now they could be retrained as engineers. There may be a dearth of them at this stage of the STEM field and so on. So you need that. The second thing from a macro point of view, and I think we show in the paper quite well, is in industry, having an industry is very much so tied up with having high rates of fixed capital investment. Now, those two things kind of feed on each other. You can ask a kind of a chicken or the egg here. Does the high fixed rate of capital lead to the industrialization, or are industrial economies more inclined to engage in fixed capital formation because of the fact that they need to continue building those industries? I'd say it's both the chicken and the egg. It's both. If you have, this is an old law that was established under the post-Keynesian economist Nicholas Kaldor as far back, I think, as in the 1960s, Kaldor's growth laws. Nobody remembers them anymore, but the empirics hold up. We showed in the paper. High rates of fixed capital investment are associated very strongly with high rates of industrial output per percentage of GDP, or whatever you want to use. And the point here is that we don't need to engage in a chicken and an egg argument at all. We just need to refocus on the fact that our economies need much higher rates of fixed capital investment. And this fixed capital investment, well, it has to go into industry. I mean, can't go much else. But currently our fixed capital stock, I'm not saying all of it, but a good deal of it is going into real estate, structures, buildings, so on. And that's kind of it's a weird outgrowth of our service-based financialized economies. But if we want to get back on track, we need to stop having a discussion of, can we ban Chinese EVs or engage in these weird protectionist measures that won't work because there's no industry protect, and ask ourselves, how do we get capital allocated to these sectors? How do we get it reallocated away from the fire sector, from finance, insurance, real estate? How do we get it reallocated from there and additional fixed capital income, fixed capital formation on top of that, and get it into the industrial sector? Now, as you said, that is a difficult problem, a really difficult problem. But until we kind of grow up and have that discussion, this whole debate's not ready for prime time.
Well, it seems to me that we're talking really about the sort of structure of capital allocation across a range of possible industrial uses, you know, from the fire sectors, finance, insurance, and real estate, to fixed capital in factories and you know, machinery. The challenge seems to me that to be able to accomplish that, you've got to convince Wall Street that they need to take a significant haircut and reallocate the money capital that currently flows its way and courses its way through the pipes of Wall Street and insurance and real estate, and say no more of that. In fact, we've got to send it over here. And it seems to me that the challenge is that the monetization of profit through trading in a financialized sector is a lot quicker to realize versus the time involved in realizing a profit through fixed capital investment. How do you break that that tendency of capital to drift towards high velocity monetization systems and move back to slow realization systems?
That's the million-dollar question. I mean, I'd go further than you. Look, we've actually had an experiment now since 2008 with allowing Wall Street and markets to do this themselves. We've driven down rates, we've driven down returns, equity valuations are sky high. I know you just said beforehand you have some experience in this sector to be, you know exactly what I'm talking about. All the pension funds are desperate for yield, reach for yield, everything like that. It was like that just before I left. And what has that done? Well, you know, in the economic theory, you know, textbooks, they'd say, well, you know, once the financial, I mean, they don't think in terms of financial assets and real assets in the textbooks, sure. But like, if you push them on it, they'd say, okay, once the financial assets aren't yielding properly, people will invest in productive plant and machinery and so on, which has a fixed rate of profit rather than a rate of return. Two different things, often conflated in the literature as well. But but actually what's happened, the one outgrowth that we've seen since 2008, now it's older than 2008, is the private equity industry, which is the closest thing that you can get, that I've seen, that you can get these finance guys to actually think about real businesses. So for listeners who aren't terribly familiar with private equity, it's a mergers and buyouts sector effectively, and people with finance brains, in a sense, that usually finance degrees, economics degrees, and so on, with experience in the financial sector, go around buying up companies, not publicly listing them, and then kind of, engaged in financial engineering. There's a lot of leverage involved. The optimistic reading is trying to improve the efficiencies of these businesses, bring them up to scale, realize synergies between the businesses and so on. And I'm sure sometimes it works, but the point that I make about this is, even pushed with those low returns into private equity, as we've seen in recent years, it hasn't spurred on these guys to start factories at all. That's never even come to mind. Instead, what they're usually doing is buying up small, underdeveloped, what Americans would call mom and pop shop kind of, insurance brokerages or call centers, or, there's a lot of real estate stuff going on in that sector too. But this is all kind of like, to the extent that the stuff means anything, and there are some actually small light industry that's been scaled up as well. I've seen some of that. It's rarer, I have to be honest, as far as I can tell. But even with that, the focus is on already existing businesses. The focus is on not so much plowing capital into these businesses. Now, they say they do, they leverage them up and they plow money into them, but they even then, they're just taking over these businesses. And to be frank, if you know the private equity industry, the incentives are actually less so to build a long-term business, and they're more so to increase the financials and so on, dividend ratios, all that kind of thing for end investors. That said, the only way that I can really see in the current environment, and I've talked to colleagues about this in the United States, we've never published anything on it. I do want to write something on it at some point, but the only way I can see building that bridge that you're talking about between the Wall Street funds and the end industry is to somehow restructure and utilize the private equity industry. And I know that sounds strange because I haven't portrayed it in the best light in the past few moments, but at least there's some expertise there between the real world and financial capital. If you go up to the quant investing side where I used to work, there's no connection at all. So it seems to me that maybe some sort of restructured, repurposed private equity industry, perhaps managed by government, that probably require subsidization or something like that. That seems somewhat promising, but realistically, we need to get back to a culture where the prestige profession is an engineer rather than a financier, and that has to be the long-term goal. That's what China's like at the moment, currently.
Yeah, so we're talking about a transition from financial engineering back to chemical engineering, industrial engineering, mechanical engineering, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, all of this, I guess, really underpins some of the concerns or some of the argument that you've articulated in the second report that I touched on, which is one called Military Alliance and Economic Capacity. And in a sense, it sets up a hypothetical contrast between the economic composition, industrial composition of the BRICS economies versus the G7. Now, could you just walk us quickly through the argument that you've articulated in that report? Because in a sense, it brings to a geopolitical lens the significance of the deindustrialization issues, and why maybe this bringing these two focal lenses together might actually provoke policymakers to think afresh about exactly what they're up to when they're feeling anxious about the future security and economic prosperity of their nations.
Well, we released a report last week against the backdrop of a very testy NATO summit. The NATO summit wasn't just concerned about the situation in Europe and Ukraine and so on. The concern has now clearly spread to China. There seems to be indications, China's now viewed as an ally of Russia. So I think people are probably keeping up with these rather depressing developments. But, these have underpinnings. It's very frustrating for somebody like me who, as I said, at least since 2016 or probably earlier, I was very concerned about problems around industrialization. You've said you were too. And it's very frustrating for somebody like me. I imagine you feel the same way, to hear all these people jump on the bandwagon and kind of have no idea what they're talking about and no idea of the problems that they're talking about, and do it in such a knee-jerk reaction. And especially to lash out and just see the person who took the jobs, as the vulgar phrase would say, as the enemy of some sort. Especially frustrating given the fact that I peg this more so on the Western elite, and how they've structured their economy since the 1990s. It's kind of victim blaming in a sense, but yeah, so they've, what's happened is, I think we alluded to it at the start, that because the West is now waking up to what this deindustrialization is going to mean moving forward for Western prosperity, for relative Western power in the world, and so on. They're having a kind of a knee-jerk reaction. Now, you don't want to blame all of the shifts in geopolitical shifts on this. Obviously, the main instigator is the war in Ukraine, the alliance between China and Russia, and so on. Those are geopolitical issues for the most part. They have to do with long-standing issues in Central Europe, where I am. But they've come together. They've definitely merged with this looming fact of, frankly, economic stagnation in the West and continued robust economic growth in the rest of the world. And so the knee-jerk reaction is to marry the two things together. The issue here, of course, is that we've known since at least World War I. We've probably known earlier than that, but at least since World War I, we've known that that you need a very strong industrial base to fight modern wars. In fact, the national accounts, the very way that we measure economic growth, was come up in part to manage the war economy in World War II, because economists like Simon Kuznets realized how important the macroeconomy was to the war effort. And obviously, I am not advocating any sorts of war. I'm personally totally against it. I think it will be incredibly destructive economically and so on for any country involved. But the reality is that if NATO leaders are sitting down and looking around at a world that they see as being full of enemies and preparing for this eventual outcome, they should probably actually marry that with their other concern, which is that their economies have been deindustrialized. And that's what we're getting in the report. So I think we've done something unique. We've taken all the NATO countries together as a single bloc, and we've taken all the BRICS plus countries together. Now, of course, BRICS plus is not a military alliance in any way, although many of the members are part of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. But what that even is slightly unclear at this point. But I think the point is that going off of what we saw after the Russian war and who sanctioned Russia and who didn't, we'd have a pretty clear sense of, for example, what would happen if there was a conflict in the South China Sea, that probably the BRICS countries would not sanction China and the West would be pushed in some way into sanctioning China. Well, we haven't really thought that through. We did not think that through when we sanctioned Russia, and we saw that it didn't do very much damage at all to the Russian economy. In fact, some people are saying the Russian economy is benefiting from it. I'm open-minded to that. I wouldn't have been a year and a half ago. I would have said that's a bit of an extraordinary claim. Not so much anymore. But, you know, it's clear that the Russian sanctions, to me at least, have damaged the West and especially Europe far more than they've damaged Russia. Now, that would be absolutely nothing in comparison to China, because Russia is effectively just an energy producer for the most part. Energy and fertilizer and a few other very key components down the supply chains that are very important. But China provides components, manufacturing, steel, everything. And so in the report, we really just strip the whole thing back and we say, okay, what are the basics you need for war? And if you go back and you read these old kind of macroeconomic military studies and so on, you'll see that it's food, steel, and oil. And that should be obvious why. Your population needs to eat, the army needs to eat, mechanized infantry and aircraft need fuel, and steel you need for everything. I mean, war is just steel clashing in a sense. It hasn't changed that much since the invention of steel, just the machines have got bigger. And what we found, and we can discuss it in more detail, is I mean, just to summarize it, I don't think that the West will be able to sustain war for very long, because a good portion of its steel, it comes from China. It's a net oil importer. Its food situation is quite good. That's the one thing that I would say, although I think food now is a little bit less important for war than maybe it was even 80 years ago. But the situation doesn't look that good. And remember, we haven't even taken into account the fact that there may be an almost infinite number of components that are coming from China that will be required just to keep any sort of war going. But even on a very macro scale, you can show that, like, NATO steel production is not very high. I don't see how you could sustain even maybe even current Russian war production levels. I think will be difficult with NATO steel production, much less anything larger than that. And in terms of the situation with oil, like, there is quite a bit of oil per capita in the West, despite it being an oil importer, because of the high consumption rates. But what a war situation would mean would be extreme rationing of energy. And I just don't know if our societies would be ready for that, to be honest.
Yeah, one of the interesting things with the globalization of supply chains is that I saw a recent report which indicated that the principal American defense contractors are actually incredibly reliant upon Chinese suppliers of a whole range of componentry. So sanctioning China would probably be a case of cutting one's nose off to spite one's face, I would suspect. I mean, all of this sort of keeps driving me to, I guess, a conclusion, which is that you would actually have rocks in your head to want to prosecute war when the main objective actually is to revitalize domestic economies to improve the quality of life of people in those societies. And reading these two reports, they sort of bookend this clarion call almost for a revisitation of exactly what on earth public policy's meant to be about in the West. You mentioned earlier that Hungary has taken, where you are, has taken a bit of a different take on these issues. And of course, Hungary has maintained great working relationships actually across the board, much to its credit. And in recent times has shown that bringing Chinese investment, particularly in high-end manufacturing, has been able to facilitate the development of high technology-driven manufacturing in Hungary. Perhaps you could tell us a little bit more about what's happening in Hungary. Many people don't know much about Hungary, and yet it's actually playing a pivotal role both geopolitically, but I think also conceptually in terms of thinking about the world in different ways.
Yeah, so I think to understand what's going on in Hungary, you have to understand a little bit of what Hungary is. First of all, it's quite a small country. It's not as small as where I'm from, Ireland. It's about twice as big. It's 10 million people or so in Hungary. So it's not a very large country, but it's a country with a very difficult history since the collapse of the Habsburg monarchy at the end of the First World War. Hungary's really been through it. It's not had a very nice 20th century. It had a very hard time in the interwar period during World War II, and then it was conquered by the Soviet Union, of course. For most of the 20th century, it was under communism. And I will say, from actually being here, it is one of the more Western places that was dominated by communism. I'd compare it to kind of Eastern Germany or something like that. It is certainly a European place. It was part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, as opposed to being more Eastern. Culturally, I'd say Poland would be somewhat similar. So they've had a very difficult time with it, and they see the threat of one of being block formation, as they call it. They don't want blocks to form. They feel that anytime blocks form, Hungary gets caught in the middle of it, and it never works out well for them. So they're completely opposed to block formation. But on top of the historical circumstances that the country's found itself in, it's also, as I said, it's a relatively small economy. It's middle income. It's not, I wouldn't say it's not developed, but it's not fully developed. It hasn't got up to the per capita living standards that, say, Ireland, Britain, France, or anywhere like that, or Australia for that matter, would be in. But it's growing. And so an economy that's small and still growing up to its standards naturally will have a lot of foreign direct investment. Now, obviously, Hungary is a very sovereigntist country. It's very widely known as being a sovereigntist country, but the political leadership is very realistic. An economy of 10 million people is not going to have a domestic Hungarian car industry. And so integrating themselves into the car industries, first from Germany, which was the main business model here, and now increasingly from China, as China moves into the electronic vehicle space, makes perfect sense for Hungary. And so it's pursued. So they have this funny convergence of their geopolitical thinking, their geostrategic thinking that's developed over 100 years of pretty miserable times, And on top of that, they have the need for this connection to the rest of the world economy, and so they've come up with a kind of a strategy that the Prime Minister's office calls connectivity. And what they're not advocating is globalization 2.0. I think everybody realizes globalization. We've probably had enough of that. It was positive for some countries. It was negative for some countries. On balance, it was probably positive for humanity, I'd say, in terms of getting people out of poverty and so on. But I think we've all come to see that globalization has probably reached this cycle anyway. It's probably reached its limits. And so what Hungary is calling for is definitely not some sort of return to 90s free trade dogma, but rather to look at the global economy that globalization's built over the course of 30 years. And it's quite clear now what it is. It's very different to what it was 30 years ago or 40 years ago. But it is what it is, and we can see its contours and we understand to a large extent how it works. And to look at that and to say, okay, that model came with a loss of many things, especially to the wealthier countries. How do those wealthier countries get those things back within the framework of this globalization? And that's very much so a long-term project. It's not a short-term project. So just to take a kind of random example, the economist David P. Goldman often talks about this, that, you know, to reindustrialize America, for example, they will need Chinese imports. They'll need Chinese capital goods imports. They'll need all sorts of intermediate inputs and so on. We did another study on this a while back showing dependencies, relative dependencies on capital goods and intermediary goods. These dependencies aren't going away. And so if America or if anywhere else wants to rebuild, for example, its steel industry, well, who has the leading steel industry now in the world? It's China. China has the leading steel industry, or aluminium is the same, or bauxite, or zinc, or any of these things. If you want to rebuild those industries, you're probably best off continuing, you know, buying that capital goods equipment from China, maybe importing expertise from China. I know that's very controversial now, but I doubt the Chinese are going to steal the secrets of American steel at this stage. So I don't think there's any security risk at this point. But, you know, thinking in those terms and to think constructively and to just say, look, the world is what it is. It's hard to admit maybe some mistakes were made. I mean, certainly that there were no mistakes made for the average Chinese person, but maybe there were some mistakes made from the point of view of the Western economies. Well, we can't turn back time. We can't do that. And so the best thing to do is just consider the situation as it currently is. And each country should try and find what's best for that country within that regime. For Hungary, it's very clear. It's accepting FDI from everyone. From anywhere that wants to put it into Hungary, they're accepting FDI, and they just want to build relationships. More relationships is better, especially for a small country that's caught in a difficult circumstance. Because, you know, from an asset management point of view, it's kind of like diversification of your portfolio or whatever. So there's many different components to why this is the case. But Hungary will be the first to say that the connectivity strategy for Hungary will look fundamentally different from the connectivity strategy that maybe they'd implicitly advocate for in the United States. But hopefully that kind of gives you some sense of what's going on.
Yeah, connectivity is a really interesting idea, I think, because it speaks to a way of thinking about relationships between nations and economies that may not necessarily be, as you say, globalization 2.0, but nonetheless refuses the notion that this phase of human economic history is one where the different parts of the world disconnect, right? And in fact, it seems that there's an argument here that connecting more is important, and what's important is to work out how to connect. The speaking of that, and you mentioned the NATO summit of last week. Now that intersected with actually quite a significant event, I think, and maybe not of a short-term significance, but certainly has potential to be of medium-term significance, and that was Prime Minister Orban's visits to Kiev, Moscow, Beijing, Washington, and ultimately down to Florida. From where you sit, what do you make of it?
Well, the Hungarians have not liked the war from the beginning. They do. You probably get from what I was saying about bloc formation and so on that wars precipitate that sort of thing. The war is on the border here. Transcarpathia is quite close. The inflation here was extremely bad. In most of Central and Eastern Europe, the inflation was particularly bad. Now, there's multiple causes for that, having their own currencies and so on, but being in such close proximity to the war has been very difficult as well. The Hungarians are very sensitive to their relations with the Russians. A lot of people get very mad about it in Hungary that they're accused of being so close to the Russians. I think the Prime Minister is constantly reminding people that he fought against the Russians in the 1990s and that they really did not appreciate being part of the Soviet Empire. But they do understand that Russia is a fact that exists over there. It's existed for a very long time. It's existed for a longer time than other countries in the region. Seems to be forgotten often. And the feeling is that Russia's not going away. I think there's also a sense, knowing that you're probably not going to beat the Russians in a land war in territory. A lot of people have tried that. Ask Napoleon, ask Hitler. Tends not to work out so well. And so I think they were quite bearish on the war from the very beginning. Obviously, Hungary is an important NATO member, so it went along with most of the things apart from weapons shipments, I believe. But it was never particularly keen on the war. I think it was mainly that they just saw it as a losing prospect. Beyond that, there were probably things built on top of that, but I think that was the primary reason. And realizing how destructive it could be to lose such a war and all the sanction policies and so on that came with it. So the Hungarians are very enthusiastic to get peace in Europe. I think they saw an opportune time. Will be my reading on it. They saw an opportune time. They saw the fact that now the newspapers have at least accepted the fact that the war is not going well. I don't know if they're at the point now where they think a loss is inevitable, although I get the feeling a lot of people think that. I'm coming from the UK only a few months ago, you know, that's where I was living prior to this. So I think they realized that people are beginning to wake up to the actual realities of the war. Joe Biden is in an incredibly weak position as president at the moment. I mean, there's even questions about whether, you know, the war was ultimately signed off on while he was suffering from some sort of cognitive impairment, which is extremely concerning and something that I think people are only beginning to talk about. But I think they saw that the whole thing was coming down. Trump increasingly looked like he was going to get elected. Now, after the events on Saturday, I mean, most people are saying it's a certainty. I wouldn't see any reason to disagree with that. And Trump has committed to ending the war. In fact, he's just appointed J.D. Vance as his vice president. And J.D. Vance has made the Ukraine war one of his major issues, actually, in the Senate. He's been one of the lone voices in the Senate. So I think the Hungarians saw an opportunity, not so much to engage in diplomacy. I don't think that was the goal. I think they saw that people weren't even talking to each other, at least publicly. People weren't even talking to each other. And so my understanding is all the Prime Minister did was go to Ukraine, ask what the terms were, go to Russia, ask what the terms were, and then deliver that message to the Europeans and the Americans. And the fact that, you know, that has to be done 2.5 years into a war is a little bit depressing and says something about the current state of international diplomacy. But I think that was the underlying motivation. And I think all things told, I think it's been a success. There was some initial media criticism. There was the usual Viktor Orban's an ally of Putin and all this kind of thing. But I think now that it's kind of toned down, people can kind of get the bigger picture and say, you know, maybe we can have a discussion about what each side wants. At the end of the day, this will be a negotiated settlement, no matter what happens. And so for a negotiation to take place, initial terms need to be on the table.
Yeah, it's remarkable that even the idea of speaking to the belligerent parties has now become taboo. It's quite shocking, actually, sitting and watching this unfold from my part of the world here in Asia, to think that parties involved in conflicts no longer have the capacity to speak with each other, number one. But worse than that, that they're surrounded by a bunch of folk who actively make it impossible for anybody to have these discussions, even on their behalf, because the fingers are pointed pretty much before you even get out of the blocks. All of this is a bit depressing, and I just wanted to flip to one last thing, which really wasn't on my radar until probably about an hour ago, and that was a message that you posted on Twitter X, and it flagged a short discussion that you had published on unheard, and it raised the prospects of the current state of global finance, possibly more Western finances, being possibly on the edge of another Minsky moment a la 2008. Um, could you just sort of talk us through that thinking, and then perhaps if I could provoke you to reconnect that up with where we started this conversation, which was around the structural challenges of reindustrialization and how problems in finance related to the Minsky moment ideas may reverberate through the way we think about the challenges of reindustrialization.
Yeah, so basically where I'm coming at it from is after 2008 is when I started my career in finance, quite a bit after 2008, but I started studying after 2008, and you know that's where I kind of formed my view of the world. And I think the Minsky stuff especially, but you know generally speaking, crisis, bubble formation, financial instability, all that kind of thing came to be associated with very high debt loads, you know, build up of a large amount of unrepayable debt in the financial sector, and that's what ultimately causes the financial crisis. And so that's kind of provoked two different streams of analysis regulation. The analysis tends to focus on debt ratios themselves. There's been a very strong interest in mortgage debt build up and so on. And the regulations have also been focused in that direction. They're to ensure that people who can't afford mortgages don't get mortgages. And if you look at the data in most Western countries, not all, but most, you'll see that mortgage debt hasn't really gone back to the same growth rates or anything like that as it did pre-2008. Private debt in general doesn't seem to have on its face, and this is a result of the regulations, obviously. Yet at the same time, if you look around in many countries, you see bubble activity. Like I used to work for Jeremy Grantham's fund. I don't know if people know the name, but Jeremy Grantham is kind of known as the bubble spotter, and I know Jeremy quite well, and we used to have long conversations. And he always said that, you know, looking at the metrics and everything's all well and good, but once you have it, kind of like once you know when a bubble's happening, it's instinctive in a sense. And I get the sense that there's very strong bubble dynamics since about 2020, especially. The question, especially in the construction sector, I don't know about Australia, but certainly in the United Kingdom, for example, Ireland, some of the other European countries, there's a lot of construction going on. And the commercial side has already collapsed in effect, although we strangely haven't seen any effects of the collapse of the commercial real estate market after the pandemic and the work from home phenomenon basically destroyed that market. We haven't seen any results from that. So the question is, why is that? Why is all that happening? And increasingly, I've come to think that the lending has been pushed out of the banking sector and into what's sometimes called the shadow banking sector, but which is really private equities and hedge funds, private equity industry and hedge funds, and the
Let's
new
just call
industry
it
of private
non-bank
credit.
finance. Let's just call it non-bank
Yeah,
finance.
non-bank finance. Shadow banking makes it sound nefarious, and I have no
Yeah.
inherent problem with many of these vehicles. Yeah, non-bank finance. That's where it's come from. And so the long view of it is that's very concerning because currently pension funds, and I know this is a huge issue in Australia at the moment, pension funds are now buying into these non-bank financing vehicles, which will mean that if anything happens with them, they will need bailouts because it will be you won't be able to just say, oh, this is a few hedge fund guys losing their shirt. If the pension funds are invested in them, they'll need bailouts. By the way, I think the banking sector might be invested in these non-bank finances too. That's a whole other conversation. But basically, the story that I wrote for Unheard today is it's basically bouncing off a Financial Times report that's saying that the private equity industry, which has been running on borrowed time for some time now, from what I could tell from talking to industry insiders and so on, has kind of been caught out, engaged in this very strange debt financing where they basically borrow large amounts of money on their net asset value. So they're called NAV loans. So they're just borrowing on the entire portfolio. They're using the portfolio as collateral and they're borrowing on it. Now you say, okay, well, maybe they're doing that to buy up more, you know, funds or something. No, they're doing it to pay off dividends. Now, if anyone's actually read Minsky, that's what he'd call Ponzi financing. He applied Ponzi financing to when you take on debt to pay off your interest payments. But in this non-banking field, interest payments are effectively dividends, right? Because you're your whole ownership structure is equity, and there isn't demands of dividends, obviously, but there's expectations of it. Otherwise, people will pull money from your fund if they don't see the
Well,
dividends. So what's
well,
actually happened is
Philip, it could actually be interest if it's through something like a unit trust, where the financial product is actually an income product supposedly secured by mortgages, but the payment is interest. So it could be a combination of both, not
it
just
probably is.
dividend, not just dividend, right? So, you know, it could get very messy. Sorry to interrupt.
No, you're absolutely right. I mean, the funny part of this story is though that the investors who were receiving the dividends told the funds to stop. So that's a very unusual thing. Creditors would not tell you to keep borrowing to get the money, but obviously the investors were so concerned about this. Now, what does that mean? I mean, it doesn't mean anything tangibly, but it feels to me like that might be the end of the chain. Minsky always said once you've got to Ponzi borrowing, you're pretty much at the end stage of the game. So that's what that will be the risk. I'm not saying it will happen, but it's certainly a risk that if we see a meltdown of borrowing, all the central banks and so on will say, well, we kept all the regulations tight, loan to value ratios never got too bad, mortgage debt growth didn't, they monitored all the stuff that happened last time, and they just drove the borrowing underground into non-banking vehicles. And then the response to that used to be, well, if they blow up, it's their own business, not if pension funds are invested in them. So there could be a replay of this. It could be very similar to last time, and it could be quite scary in that regard. But just to speak very briefly to the issues with financial structure or economic structure and so on, certainly this is all tied to the fact we have financialized economies, we don't have industrial economies, all of that. The one thing I'd really highlight though is with all these policymakers making these big policy changes and wanting to engage in protectionism or all this magical thinking that they're engaging and sanctions and all this kind of thing. But what I really want to get through to them, and I'm often called kind of a perma bear or something for trying to say this, but I'm just telling the truth. Western economies are not in a good state. They're very, very fragile. And these big debt piles and financial instability and everything, these are major symptoms of an underlying problem. And if you engage in economic warfare against far more stable and powerful countries like China, for example, you will lose that game. I think these policymakers and so on, who are mostly lawyers probably, don't understand because they just see the wealth around them, and the wealth seems to be more than the wealth in China. They think that they've got a bigger army for their economic war, but they really need to wake up to the fact that they don't have that, or it could result in catastrophe, frankly.
Yeah, it's quite scary that folks sitting in those policy-making positions and decision-making positions, in a sense, can't tell the difference between the real economy and a financialized economy, because fundamentally making decisions about analog activities on the basis of financial metrics is a recipe for disaster, it seems to me.
Absolutely, absolutely. And we don't even need to get started into US dollar and how it's propped up with finance and so on. It's just the whole
But one
thing
last
sits in this big financial house of cards. They need to be really careful with this.
Well, I guess just one last thing, just to pick your brains on, really, and this is the question of why or when it could come to a head. And it seems to me that a lot of these issues come to a head when maturity dates of some of these products arrive. And I've been looking at the commercial real estate market in the United States, for example, and it seems that a fairly large amount of the loans against the commercial real estate sector are coming to maturity in 2024 and 2025, which could be the moment because they won't get refinanced, it seems to me, which when that doesn't happen, then the lender will have little choice but to liquidate the assets and do what they can to patch the hole in their balance sheets. Do you think that that's one of the big issues coming up on the horizon that might focus people's
Yes.
minds on these things?
Yes, the maturities is, I mean, that's part of the NAV lending that we're seeing as well. This really is a financial structure at the end of its rope, really. It's really what Minsky described in just about every way. And then on top of that, I'd highlight this the election, really. I know that usually people in finance ignore elections or whatever. But we've seen increasing, I've been writing a lot about this and tweeting a lot about this. We've seen increasing use of government finances to put pressure on governments that the current Western elite don't like. I think this began with Liz Truss. I'm not totally absolving Liz Truss from blame for her tax package or anything like that. But, you know, the fact of the matter is that people piled on her and the central bank probably could have bailed her out. And then we saw it again when people thought Le Pen was about to be elected. Suddenly everybody was scared of the French deficit. And then when Le Pen didn't get elected, no more discussion of the French deficit. I have a sneaking suspicion from reading headlines and so on that something similar is going to happen when Trump gets elected. I think that there's going to be a huge push to highlight the fiscal situation in the US, which is bad. I'm not saying it's made up, but it's mainly the current administration's fault for their huge spending bills and so on. But it doesn't really matter about blame. The point is that the fiscal situation isn't great, especially the foreign treasuries market is very illiquid at the moment, unusually illiquid, and that's mainly because the Chinese aren't buying anymore. Another thing that is occasionally reported in the financial press, but not relative to the amount of, you know, to given importance. And so it feels to me that if there's a huge push next year, starting January, February, to highlight the issues with the American deficit and especially American international lending, that could create all sorts of problems as well. And of course, as you know, as everybody knows who's followed a good financial crisis, you take out one Jenga brick and the whole thing, all the fragilities come down at once. So those, yeah, those are the two things I'd watch: the private equity, whether that be the strange NAV lending that they're engaged in, or the fact that some of this stuff won't be reinvested or rolled over, and also this this fiscal situation, if and probably when at this stage Donald Trump gets elected and takes office next January.
Well, you know, it seems to me, I guess, and just by way of summary, if I may, that in the short term, we're staring down the barrel potentially of a Minsky-like moment. Minsky-like, you know, it might be a Minsky moment, but certainly something that is very disruptive in terms of the financial foundations of particularly Western economies. But all of that portends poorly for the medium-term challenges of reindustrialization, which requires substantial fixed capital and human capital investments. Now, in that context, Philip, it seems to me that now would be a pretty crazy time to be waging wars, and in fact, it would probably be a much better time to be talking a lot more about peace and connectivity.
I
So,
really, at this point, I totally agree with you. We are a little bit too late in the current cycle to talk about how we rejuvenate our economies. We're probably going to want to start to stem the bleeding at this stage. And, you know, I agree, we need to calm everything down and prepare for some potentially rough economic times, and then hopefully come up with a better plan to come out of it next cycle.
yeah, look, thanks very much again, Philip, for joining me today. I have no doubt that we could go into this and keep talking for a long time. And I have been accused at times of, you know, either detaining my guests or when I'm a guest on other shows for going on and diving into a lot of detail. But today, let's wrap it up here because I think that we've covered a huge amount of territory. I'm going to put the links to the reports that you've prepared into the description of the video. And I'd strongly encourage people to read the reports and really think hard about what those reports are trying to get at. And they're really trying to say, look, folks, the challenges that we have facing us, both in Western economies and also in global economic conditions, are very challenging. And they require serious effort, not glib, meme-driven policy responses, but perhaps they also say something about the need for countries to find ways to reconnect and to do so in ways that promote peace rather than conflict. So thanks again for joining me, and I'll hope to have you back on again at some point in the near future.